is no other than Dr. Juan Carlos T. Gonzalez, Professor 11 at the Institute of Biological Sciences in UPLB, and he is also the curator for birds at the UPLB Museum of Natural History. His presentation is titled Type Ko Ba Yan? Where in the World Are the Philippine Bird Holotypes? A brief background of Dr. Gonzalez. He obtained his doctor in philosophy and zoology at Edward Gray Institute for Field Ornithology and St. Anne's College, University of Oxford in 2012 through the support of the Ford Foundation International Fellowship Program. His research interests include the following: ornithology, wildlife biology, conservation biology, vertebrate systematics and phylogeography, tropical evolutionary ecology, and ethno-ornithology. Now, here is Dr. Juan Carlos Gonzalez.
So today I'll be talking about, well, it's a little shift from the usual research and collection sort of theme, which of course everyone's introducing a lot of newly described species. I'm talking about bird collections in general, but there's still a series of recent new species that were, or taxa described for birds. And I think there's still a lot to be discovered. And as we discover new vertebrates, we also have a lot of potential new discoveries for invertebrates and flora. So I'll just have to share my, I'll share my, share the screen. Okay, hope that's clear. Okay. So title of my talk is Type Ko Ba Yan? So where in the world are all the Philippine bird holotypes? So just to introduce you about bird collections. So the Smithsonian Institution is one of the largest bird collections in the world. And I think there was an article that came out in Audubon. And so a lot of, actually this picture came around in either about 2000. It just kind of encapsulates how big the collections are in terms of birds around the world. This particular photo includes Ms. Roxy Labor, who's a forensic ornithologist. So she studies bird feathers and how research can be done to look into forensics. The Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History collection, bird collection, or also known as the United States National Museum, contains about 640,000 specimens at a time, and it represents about the third largest bird collection in the world. So it comprises about 85% of the world's 10,000 or so bird species. On another note, the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard University is the largest university-based bird collection in the world and is 5th largest overall. That's about 4,000 bird specimens, and it also represents about 65%, 85% of the global species of birds. Whereas the American Museum of Natural History, which is the second largest collection of bird specimens in the world, about 1 million specimens, mostly, of course, composed of skin, skeletons, nest, eggs, and even tissue samples. And a large number of type specimens, both, as well as rare extinct species, also is found in the collection of the MNH, and it represents about 99% of the global birds. While also in New York is Cornell University. And of course, there is a collaboration between UPLB and Cornell in the past. That's why we have UPCO, if you're familiar with our history. And Cornell University has the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and has about 57,000 bird specimens. Of course, in the Guinness Book of World Records, the largest collection of birds is in the British Museum of Natural History, also now known as the Natural History Museum. It has 2.5 million specimens with about more than 9,000 species. I think probably 99% as well of the world species. And of course, it is the Guinness Book of World Records for having the largest collection, as well as the largest egg collection with more than 200,000 clutches of eggs and about 4,000 nests. Actually, if you go to the Natural History Museum in Tring, the whole basement floor is dedicated to these nests and eggs. So bird collections around the Philippines were all developed to help discover new taxa. So about 1800s to 1900s, a lot of discoveries were made through, of course, a lot of collaborative museum expeditions, as well as collectors from different private institutions. So among those were John Whitehead, of course, is famous for collecting the Philippine Eagle. There was Alfred Everett, who collected for Lord Tweeddale. And then there was Cameron Forbes, also known as, there was also the Jacob Steer, and Frank Bourns, Dean Worcester, of course, which formed the MNH expedition. There was the expedition of the HMS Challenger. There's the Philippine zoological expeditions in the 50s and 60s, and later on the Danish Nunandan expedition. So what was interesting about it is both Dean Worcester became the Secretary of Interior, even though he's an ornithologist, and W. Cameron Forbes became Governor General of the Philippines. So still something about politics and ornithology. Among the notable collectors, the turn century, it was Richard McGregor, who was part of the Bureau of Science Manila. He's also one of the charter members of the National Research Council of the Philippines. Marquis Masahu Hachisuka was also had an expedition just prior to World War II, so about late 35 to 39. And then after the war, Canuto Manuel of now the reconstructed Philippine National Museum was an important collector, together with Godofredo Alcacid, who became one of the first ornithologists and zoologists, became director of the National Museum. There was a lot of collaboration with local ornithologists, with John Dupont, who of course brought in with the Delaware Museum. And he collaborated a lot with our very own Dr. Curator S. Rabor. Of course, made an amazing set of collections for not just birds, but also mammals. And later on, there is a good collaboration between the Cincinnati Museum with Robert Kennedy and Pedro Gonzalez. So a lot of these collections helped develop the bird collections around the world, coming from the Philippines. And that includes a lot of these type specimens. As we know, the type is the voucher specimen, which helps as the basis for reference of a particular taxa, whether it's a species or subspecies. It is the holotype, which is that single specimen chosen to represent that particular taxa. And there are, of course, several other specimens, which include the type series, which the description is based, includes the syntypes and paratypes. There are also different other parts of the type series, such as the lectotype, which is a single specimen selected from the syntypes to of a previous series used to serve as an equivalent of that particular holotype, or if that particular type or part of the type series is lost, another specimen is chosen to help represent that type material, which is designated as the neotype. And it is quite important for types to be published by museums. Whatever collections that they have, they are most valued. It is sort of like a representation of the holdings of a museum. It's also kind of a key factor to recognizing the importance of a museum, of how many type specimens you have. Of course, in 2009, there was the National Cultural Heritage Act of 2009, which was then signed and approved in 2010 by then President Arroyo. The general objectives of this Republic Act is to protect, preserve, conserve, and promote the nation's cultural heritage, its property, its histories, and ethnicity of local communities, but also includes a large part, a discussion on collections, especially holotypes. So it was designated that the National Museum of the Philippines is the official repository of holotype specimens for flora, fauna, and fossil collection. Also associated with that is the Republic Act 9147, which is the Wildlife Resources Conservation and Protection Act. What a lot of us who does research understand that for you to collect specimens in the Philippines, you need to get a British permit, and of course you need to transfer them, you get local transport permits, so on and so forth. So just prior to this through the Public Acts, a lot of specimens were still being kept by the museums, by collaborative international museums, but a lot of them now recognize the importance of keeping the holotypes in the Philippines. So a lot of them are now being kept at the National Museum. So it includes some of these rather recently, just 20, 30 years ago. So Lina sunbird, the Tivoli sunbird, which is described as then a subspecies, now recognized as a full species. And then you have the Panay striped babbler, which of course resulted from the collaboration. The Philippine Zoological Expedition, which is collaboration between the Cincinnati Museum and the National Museum at the time. There was the Bukidnon woodcock, was also recently described, and the Calayan Rail, which was a result of an expedition to the Babuyan Islands in 2004. Then there was a description of a specimen. It was taken from actually it was not part of an expedition, but already pre-collected, and just shifting through the bird collections, you'll still find something interesting. And they were able to determine that one of these populations from Mindanao was recognized as a subspecies of the Philippine hawk eagle, and then named Pinsker's hawk eagle. Of course, later on, it was then recognized as a full species. Another expedition was led by our very own Danny Balete with the Field Museum of Natural History to help discover the Kamigin hanging parrot, which is then recognized as a separate species from a wider range of the Cocolacisi species in the Philippines. And a review of vocalizations, as well as the specimens that are pre-collected in various bird collections, including Smithsonian, helped describe 3 new taxa, 2 new species, the Cebu hawk owl, Ninox ramsey, and the Kamigin hawk owl, Ninox levantisi. And of course, you have the Romblon hawk owl, which is a subspecies of Spilonotus named after Tim Fisher. And one of the most recently described species is the Shedamati ground babbler, previously placed under Napothera rabori, which was a babbler. It's now recognized as a ground warbler, Robsonius thompsoni. So along with these other recently described, most of these holotypes are now deposited at the National Museum. So what I did actually looking into these different bird collections is going back to our own ornithological Bible, the Birds of the Philippines. I hope you still have your, what we call the Fuchsia book. And it's an amazing reference. So I know it's a little outdated, 1991. It was, of course, by DKP, Dickinson, Kennedy and Park. And it includes a checklist enumerating where and what the publication of the different types, thin types, holotypes of Philippine birds, including endemic ones. Unfortunately, for some of those specimens, there were lost type specimens, or some which could no longer be located in those particular original sources, mostly from Paris and Germany, those which were earlier described by Daubinton and Sonny Rath. Some of the specimens may have been lost because of the impacts of World War II, like it was in Dresden. The same thing happened with the Bureau of Science in Manila, where we lost a lot of our own holotypes when the Bureau of Science Manila was bombed. So of course, there was a need to designate a lot of these new types because of these lost types. Okay, looking into that through that checklist, and actually still have my notes here for all of each of those collections from each of the species. So I actually used the checklist of the Wild Birds of the Philippines. You can get to, if you want to see the checklist, you can download it from their website and look at, again, each of those types, whether it's a syn type, a holotype, and there's where the collections are found and who was the collector. So the top collectors included John Whitehead, Alfred Averett, Mearns, and of course, Jacob Steer. But for the Philippines, Dr. Rabor, of course, helped collect 48 described different species and subspecies of birds. So where in the world are all these types? So there was a lot of, there's actually more than 40, 50 different locations and institutions indicated from all the lists I've made. but I'm just picking out some selected museums which had more or less the highest numbers. So the British Museum or the National History Museum has about nearly 400 types of both species and subspecies. This was followed by both the Smithsonian Institution and the American Museum of Natural History. Then the Field Museum and the Delaware Museum of Natural History. And just below 50 is the Yale Peabody Museum. Of course, Dr. Bohr had a lot of collaboration with Yale, where he also had his doctorate. In the Philippines, of course, you have less than 50 specimens recognized for the National Museum. So how many in the world? So here are the exact numbers. I'm not going to put all the about 40, 50 different collections. Just again, British Museum with 374, the Smithsonian with 172, the American Museum with 179, the Field Museum with 90, Delaware Museum with 50, and the Yale Peabody Museum with 22. So altogether, the US museums would have about 513. So a lot of, well, all of these 5 museums in the US sums to about 513 types, which is quite enormous. So if you need to look at all and review the different types, you need to go to the US. How many types are remaining in the Philippines? There's less than 5 national collections, which of course represent them. I have 3 of them here. Then Bureau of Science Manila had more than 30 specimens or types, but of course, a lot of them were lost. Some were assigned neotypes. The National Museum has 28, and University of the Philippines has 2, including one which was named after then the First Lady Imelda Marcos by Professor De La Cruz, the amethyst, emeldific amethyst brown dove from Marinduque. In terms of interesting species, especially the rare species like critically endangered birds, where do you find some of their holotypes? So the University of Michigan Museum of Zoology, of course, is where the rufous-headed hornbill or Walden's hornbill is deposited, while the Sulu hornbill is in the Museum of Natural History in Paris, and the Cebu Flowerpecker, so the rarest birds in the world, and the Philippine Eagle, our national emblem, are both in the British Museum or the Natural History Museum, each of which was collected by Everett and Whitehead. You know, John Whitehead, of course, collected the Philippine Eagle in Parana, Samar, and named it after his father, Jeffrey. Well, Ogilvy Grant named it after his father, Jeffrey. So some of these bird collections with notable Philippine specimens. So it's a lot of course, field expedition, more recent with the University of Kansas Biodiversity Institute, the Field Museum, the Delaware Museum of Natural History, which is led by DuPont, collaborating with Rabor in the mid-80s and 70s, the Yale Peabody Museum, American Museum of Natural History, the Smithsonian Institution, and the Carnegie Museum also has an interesting, well, not just types, but a lot of bird collections from the Philippines. For in the Philippines, where do you find a lot of these bird collections? So of course, in Europe, apart from in the US, I have the Natural History Museum, the Natural History Museum in Paris, the Leiden University. There are specimens also in the National Museum in Ueno in Japan, and the Kuroda collection, which is now in the Yamashina Institute of Ornithology. In Germany, you have Dresden, the Senckenberg, as well as Hamburg. While in the Philippines, if you want to see bird collections, of course, the largest should be in the National Museum. Now, the Philippine National Museum is now recognized as the National Museum of Natural History of the Philippines. Of course, one of the oldest collections and quite significant is the Museo de Natural de History of the University of Santo Tomas. I think it's an amazing collection. They have about 6 of the Saris cranes. They actually lent them to the National Museum because they lost their own Saris crane specimen. So it's now on loan from UST, including the spot-billed pelican, which is named after the Philippines. Silliman University, the National Science Museum, and both the Mindanao State University in Marawi, which is the Aga Khan Museum, and the Iligan Institute of Technology Science Museum also holds an interesting collection of birds. Of course, the UPLB Museum has one of the largest, and the Institute of Biology in Diliman also holds a sizable collection of bird specimens, as well as the University of San Carlos in Cebu, and these Central Mindanao University in Muswan. So there was always a question about types. Is there an issue of repatriation? So a lot of specimens are being returned to the Philippines, one of the holotypes. After they've been studied, I think it's part of the both heritage and just part of the collaboration between museums who were part of the expedition. But can international museums return the specimens to the Philippines, especially prior to the heritage law or before any major collaboration? Again, it all depends on the museums themselves. But based on the heritage law of 2009, all holotypes should be deposited at a Philippine institution, such as the National Museum or even the UPLB Museum of Natural History. There are specimens which are going to be hard to find because they're gone for good. So luckily, there are specimens of the Luzon Saras crane in the Philippines. There's also some specimens outside, including Smithsonian. It is supposed to be the tipol, local name, which is the largest bird in the Philippines, went extinct in the 50s. Antigone luzonica. And then there was another species that went extinct in 80s, the Tico pterictic hornbill, which is a small island in the Masbate group off Bicol Peninsula. Both were described by Hachisuka in 1941 and 1930s, respectively. Of course, both subspecies are now extinct. Here is one illustration depicted by the famous Filipino artist, Jose Honorato Lozano. There's always the last chance to find, although a lot of books have already recognized them as possibly extinct or functionally extinct, but there is still research to be done to find and confirm that these species are in fact missing or gone. The Sulu bleeding heart from the Sulu archipelago, which was described by Bourns and Worcester in 1894 from Dawi-Dawi, and then you have the Negros fruit dove, Tunopus urcanus, which was described from specimens taken in 1955 by Ripley and Rabor from Mount Canlaw. So here is I represent, at least for Milaja, at least there's 2 or 3 specimens, but for the Negros fruit dove, there's only one single specimen in the holotype, which is the female at the Peabody Museum, as shown here. Of course, with the D.S. Rabor collection at the Museum of Natural History, there's a lot of things that still can be done in terms of studying those specimens, a wealth of knowledge, and possibly finding new species. We've actually found 2 new genera of, well, new records of genera of Malaphagan lice from the hornbills, which was done a study by one of my students, Ms. Fabregas. But there's also a collection of Rabor outside Museum of Natural. So this is one of the woolly neck storks that's found at the Aga Khan Museum. And to consolidate this, a PhD student, Professor Dance, is doing a study on the status of the Rabor collection, both in the Philippines and outside the Philippines. There's roughly about 60,000 specimens that were collected by Rabor during his time. So in the Rabor collection, there was a description of Mindanao sunbirds, both the one named after the wife of Dr. Rabor, Ma'am Lina. So Lina Raborai, Atopiga Lina Raborai and Atopiga Bolton Tibuli was named after specimens that were collected by Rabor. Actually, at the time, Bob Kennedy went of this then Cincinnati Museum of Natural History, borrowed some of the specimens to review and of course describe those to taxa, and of course were recently returned to the collection. So among the largest collections that were facilitated by Rabor, through his collaborations. Outside the Philippines, the largest would be the Yale Peabody Museum, about 5,000 specimens at least. But of course, there's a sizable collection resulting from a collaboration with the Field Museum, as well as the Delaware Museum of Natural History. In the Philippines, there's three largest collections of Rabor are in the Silliman University, Mindanao State University, and of course, UPLB Museum of Natural History. Surfing through the collections here at the Museum of Natural History, one of my students, Yasmin Salces, did her undergrad thesis on the elegant tit. She did a comparison of the subspecies and the different island populations of the widely cosmopolitan. Well, again, it's still an endemic to the Philippines, but it's widely distributed across the archipelago. And using the Tobias criteria, which is a criteria published by the British Ornithologists Union, looking into species limits, looking whether subspecies are recognizable as full species. So she looked into the elegant titmouse. Of course, no sizable data was able to determine that they could be split to species. However, comparison to populations to think that the lady population might be a distinct and possibly undescribed subspecies, which I hope she still has to write now that she's a medical doctor. And last but not the least, there is a species, a taxa, a species that was described by her very own, the late Pedro Alviola, who described Batrachostomus pygmaeus from a specimen that was collected in Palawit. And the holotype, of course, is at the Museum of Natural History. I think this, although it was subsumed under this Palawan frogmouth, I think it would, looking into the description, it is considerably smaller as a population around around the Calamianes, and should be recognized as a valid subspecies of the Palawan frogmouth. Again, the type is here at the Museum of Natural History, and hopefully we could resurrect this as a valid taxon, Batrachostomus chassinii pygmaeus. And with that, I'd like to thank the organizers, and of course wish the Museum of Natural History a happy 46th anniversary. Thank you very much. Back to you, Dex.
Thank you very much, Dr. JC. And again, may we call on our moderator, Professor Annalie Hadsal, to start our short open forum. Ma'am, you may take the floor.
Yeah, good morning. Okay. Any question? Before I think I'd like to answer the question of Dr. Gonzalez. Type mo ba yan? Type na type ko, Sir JC, ang iyong presentation, especially when you talk of holotypes. Not all students would know what a holotype is, and you give actually the significance of holotypes, not only for birds, for animals, but also for plants, for new species of fungi. You need to have this holotype. Question from the audience? Walang gustong magtanong, natakot yata. Any question? Okay. Sir, ako na lang magtanong. You know, yung idea of repatriation, talaga pang we cannot do anything about this because not only for birds, but also we have a lot of these plants, before that were now deposited in other herbaria. So yung idea of repatriation is really, that's where it has to stay,
Yes, Paul. Thank you for that question, Mama. I think it all depends on the collaboration between the different museums that help collect those specimens. So whether it's flora or fauna. If it's before the heritage law, then wala tayong magagawa. It's up to their decision. There are museums which have borrowed specimens in the past and have returned and repatriated some of those specimens that they have put on loan back into the Museum of Natural History. So, classic example, yung Dinagat Cloud Rat, because that is from the Museum of Natural History. So Larry, and then of course had it returned after they finished their analysis, well, whatever research they were doing to which involves that cloud rat, and actually also includes some of the podogymnores as well. So those are examples. Tapos more recently, when Bob Kennedy came back to the Philippines, he also returned some of the sunbird specimens they borrowed when they did those studies on sunbirds of Mindanao. So yes, it's to do, well, those are because borrowed naman siya. Talaga kailangan isole. But in terms of repatriation, again, before the heritage law, so I think that's the reason why they probably did heritage law. It's for us to have the repository of those holotype naman ang requirements. I think all the other parts of the type series can still be kept by the hosting university, who of course helped do the expedition. It's just the holotype which needs to be in the Philippines. So for us, it's part of our heritage, and for us also access. Ang hirap kasi na ikaw mismo mag-aaral, kailangan mo pumunta ng ibang bansa just to see your own holotype.
Okay, thank you. Anybody from the audience? All right. Anyway, if you have not yet thought of the question right now, we'll have an open forum, a panel discussion later on, so you can reserve your questions. Okay, Sir JC, let me present to you itong ating e-certificate, no? The University of the Philippines, Los Baños, the UPLB Museum of Natural History awards the Certificate of Appreciation to Dr. Juan Carlos T. Gonzalez for serving as resource person during the UPLB Museum of Natural History special webinar on research and collection, given this 29th day of September 2022 during the museum's 46th anniversary celebration with the theme, Continuing Excellence Through Adversity, Creating Partnerships, Fruitful Research, and Digitized Collections. Signed, Marian P. De Leon, Director. Thank you. Congratulations, Sir JC.